Have you ever wondered why you hate certain things or people? Could this hatred say more about you than about others? In everyday life, it's common to feel aversion towards certain people, behaviors, or situations. This feeling, often intense and charged with negative energy, may seem directed only at others. But what if I tell you that the hatred you feel could be a reflection of something within yourself? The idea that how much of you exists in what you hate isn't new. It relates to deep psychological concepts like projection, explored by Freud, and the shadow, proposed by Carl Jung. These thinkers suggest that what bothers us most in others might be a mirror of aspects we don't want to recognize in ourselves. Could what you hate most in others actually be something you reject in yourself? Hatred is one of the most intense and complex emotions humans can experience. Unlike passing feelings like irritation or disgust, hatred is a deep and lasting aversion, often accompanied by anger, frustration, and even fear. It can be directed at people, groups, ideas, or even specific aspects of life. But what really defines hatred? Why does it arise, and what is its role in our psyche? To understand this, we need to dive not only into the psychology of emotions, but also into the workings of the unconscious, as proposed by Sigmund Freud, one of the pillars of psychoanalysis. Freud, in his studies of the human mind, described hatred as an emotion deeply rooted in our primitive instincts. He associated hatred with what he called the death drive, or thanatos, an internal force that drives us to destroy or push away what we perceive as a threat. In his work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle of 1920, Freud explains that hatred is not just a reaction to the external, but also an expression of unresolved internal conflicts. He states, "Hatred, as a relation to objects, is older than love. It emerges from the ego's primordial repudiation of the external world with its flood of stimuli." This idea suggests that hatred can be a form of defense, a way to protect the ego from something that threatens us emotionally or psychologically. But why do we feel hatred? The answer might lie in how our brain processes emotions and how our psyche deals with internal conflicts. Hatred, in many cases, is a response to something that challenges our values, beliefs, or identity. For example, we might hate someone who represents a behavior we reject in ourselves, such as arrogance, insecurity, or aggressiveness. This phenomenon, known as projection, was extensively studied by Freud and his followers. Projection occurs when we attribute to others feelings, desires, or characteristics that we don't want to recognize in ourselves. Thus, hatred can be a way of externalizing internal conflicts, projecting onto others what we can't face within ourselves. However, hatred isn't always rational. Often it's fueled by prejudices, past experiences, or even unconscious aspects of our mind. For example, someone who grew up in an environment where the expression of certain emotions was repressed might develop an intense hatred for those who openly express these same emotions. This hatred, although seemingly directed at others, might actually be a reaction to the internal repression the person experienced. Freud drew attention to the fact that many of our emotions and behaviors are governed by unconscious forces that we don't always understand or control. Hatred, in this sense, can be seen as a manifestation of these hidden forces. But hatred isn't just a destructive emotion. It can also serve as a defense mechanism, helping us establish boundaries and protect our identity. For example, Hating an injustice can motivate us to fight for social change. However, when hatred is directed at people or groups indiscriminately, it can blind us to the complexity of reality. When we hate, we tend to simplify others, reducing them to what bothers us, without seeing the multiplicity of factors that might be behind their actions. This process of simplification can lead to prejudice, discrimination, and even violence, and therein lies the danger. Hatred can distance us from a deeper understanding of ourselves and others. Instead of helping us grow, it can keep us trapped in cycles of negativity and conflict. Freud warned about the risks of not confronting our darkest emotions. In his view, hatred, when not understood and worked through, can become a destructive force, both for the individual and society. He wrote, "The ego is not master in its own house." This phrase summarizes the idea that many of our emotions, including hatred, are influenced by unconscious forces that we don't always control. In the previous chapter, we explored hatred as a complex emotion, rooted in our primitive instincts and internal conflicts. Now, let's dive into a fundamental concept to understand why we hate: projection. Projection is a psychological mechanism in which we attribute to other people feelings, desires, or characteristics that we don't want to recognize in ourselves. This phenomenon, extensively studied by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, helps us understand why we often see in others what is, deep down, within ourselves. But projection isn't just a concept in psychology. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche also reflected on how our emotions and judgments are often reflections of our own internal condition. Nietzsche, in his work Beyond Good and Evil from 1886, wrote a phrase that deeply echoes the idea of projection. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. This quote suggests that what we fight against or hate can somehow transform us or reveal aspects of ourselves that we prefer to ignore. In other words, the hatred we feel can be a mirror reflecting parts of our own shadow, those aspects of our personality that we reject or repress. But how does projection work in practice? Imagine someone who hates arrogance in others. This hatred might arise because they themselves fear being perceived as arrogant, or because, at some level, they recognize traits of arrogance in themselves but can't accept them. By projecting this characteristic onto others, they temporarily free themselves from the discomfort of confronting this part of themselves. However, this release is illusory, as the internal conflict remains. Freud explained that projection is an ego defense mechanism, a way to protect our self-image by attributing to others aspects we consider unacceptable in ourselves. Carl Jung, in turn, expanded this idea by introducing the concept of shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents all aspects of our personality that we reject or deny. These aspects can include emotions like anger, envy, fear, or even positive characteristics that, for some reason, we don't allow ourselves to express. Jung believed that until we confront and integrate our shadow, we will continue to project it onto others, often unconsciously. Hatred, in this sense, can be seen as a reaction to our own shadow, which we see reflected in another person's behavior or characteristics. But projection isn't limited to individual characteristics. It can also occur at a collective level, influencing how groups and societies view each other. For example, in contexts of social or political conflict, it's common for groups to project onto enemies aspects they reject in themselves. A group that values order and discipline might hate another group they perceive as chaotic or disorganized, without recognizing that this aversion might be linked to an internal fear of disorder or loss of control. Nietzsche, in his critique of morality, argued that many of the values we consider good or bad are actually projections of our own needs and desires. He wrote, "Morality is the herd instinct in the individual." This idea suggests that our moral judgments, including hatred, are influenced by social and psychological dynamics that we don't always recognize. Projection can also be observed in personal relationships. How many times have we caught ourselves hating in someone a characteristic that, deep down, we know we also possess? A classic example is the hatred of hypocrisy. Many people feel deeply irritated by others' hypocrisy, but rarely stop to reflect if they themselves have acted hypocritically at some point. This hatred might be a way of projecting our own guilt or discomfort with the idea that we too are fallible and contradictory. Freud drew attention to the fact that we often hate in others what we can't accept in ourselves. However, projection isn't necessarily negative. It can be a powerful tool for self-knowledge if we know how to use it. By recognizing that the hatred we feel might be a reflection of our own shadow, we can begin to explore these hidden aspects and work to integrate them into our personality. Jung believed that the process of shadow integration was essential for personal development and achieving psychological balance. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This idea suggests that by confronting our projections and the hatred that arises from them, we can take control of our own life and avoid being dominated by unconscious patterns. But how can we do this in practice? A first step is to practice self-reflection. When we feel hatred for someone or something, we can ask ourselves, what is this person or situation showing me about myself? This question can lead us to valuable insights about our fears, insecurities, and desires. Another step is to cultivate empathy. By trying to understand the motivations and circumstances of those we hate, we can begin to see beyond the projection and recognize the shared humanity that connects us. Previously, we explored how projection leads us to see in others what we don't want to recognize in ourselves. Now, let's enter an even deeper territory: how hatred can be a powerful tool for self-knowledge. Although hatred is often seen as a negative and destructive emotion, it can also be a catalyst for significant internal transformations. Philosophers like Socrates already suggested that self-knowledge is the key to a fulfilling life. The famous maxim, "Know thyself," inscribed at the Oracle of Delphi and adopted by Socrates, reminds us that the journey to understand our darkest emotions, like hatred, is essential for personal growth. But how can we transform hatred, such an intense and often overwhelming emotion, into a tool for self-knowledge? The answer lies in learning to look at hatred not as an enemy, but as a messenger. When we feel hatred, it's telling us something about ourselves, about our wounds, our fears, and our unmet needs. German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, known for his reflections on human nature, wrote, "Hatred is an emotion that can only exist in relation to something that deeply affects us." This idea suggests that hatred isn't random. It arises in response to something that touches our deepest vulnerabilities. A practical example of this can be found in interpersonal relationships. Often, we hate in someone a characteristic that, deep down, reminds us of a part of ourselves that we can't accept. For instance, a person who hates arrogance in others may actually be struggling against their own tendency to be arrogant or against the fear of being perceived as such. Instead of simply rejecting this hatred, we can use it as a starting point to explore our own insecurities and contradictions. Schopenhauer argued that true wisdom begins when we recognize our own limitations. In this sense, hatred can be an invitation to recognize and work on our internal limitations. Another important aspect is understanding that hatred doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's closely linked to other emotions, such as fear, anger, and sadness. When we hate, we're often reacting to a perceived threat, be it real or imaginary. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, in his work Being and Nothingness, explored the idea that our emotions are active responses to the world, not mere passive reactions. He wrote, "Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does." This idea reminds us that although we can't completely control our emotions, we can choose how we respond to them. Hatred, therefore, can be an opportunity to take responsibility for our reactions and explore what they reveal about ourselves. But how can we do this in practice? A first step is to practice self-reflection. When we feel hatred, we can ask ourselves, what is this emotion trying to tell me? This question can lead us to valuable insights about our needs, values, and fears. For example, if we hate a person who seems to always get what they want, we might be projecting our own frustration at not achieving our goals. By recognizing this, we can begin to work towards greater assertiveness and self-confidence. Another important step is cultivating empathy. Although it may seem contradictory, trying to understand the perspective of those we hate can help us see beyond our projections and recognize the shared humanity that connects us. Roman philosopher Seneca, in his writings on anger, suggested that understanding is the first step towards healing. By trying to understand the motivations and circumstances of those we hate, we can begin to dissolve hatred and transform it into compassion. Additionally, hatred can lead us to question our values and beliefs. Often we hate what challenges our deepest convictions. For example, a person who values honesty may hate those they perceive as liars. However, by exploring this hatred, they may discover that their own relationship with truth is not as simple as they imagined. Perhaps they themselves have lied in difficult situations or have trouble facing painful truths. This process of questioning can lead to greater authenticity and integrity. We have explored hatred as a complex emotion, rooted in our primitive instincts, internal conflicts, and projection mechanisms. We've also seen how it can be a powerful tool for self-knowledge, revealing aspects of our shadow that need to be integrated. Now, we come to a crucial point: how to deal with hatred practically and transform it into a positive force for personal growth. This transformation is not simple, but it's possible when we approach hatred with awareness, compassion, and willingness to change. Philosophers like the Stoic Epictetus have reflected on the importance of transforming our negative emotions into opportunities for growth. He said, "It's not things that disturb us, but our perception of them." This idea reminds us that hatred, like any emotion, can be reinterpreted and redirected for constructive purposes. The first step in dealing with hatred is to recognize and accept it. Often we try to deny or repress hatred, either because we consider it a bad emotion or because we fear its consequences. However, as we've seen in previous chapters, hatred is an important message about our needs, fears, and values. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, in his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra, wrote, "All that is done for love is beyond good and evil." This phrase suggests that by accepting our darkest emotions, like hatred, we can transcend simplistic judgments and find a path to transformation. Accepting hatred doesn't mean justifying it or acting on it, but rather recognizing its existence and exploring its roots. Once we recognize hatred, the next step is to understand its causes. As we've seen, hatred often arises as a response to something we perceive as a threat. It can be a threat to our values, our identity, or our emotional security. French philosopher René Descartes, in his reflections on the passions of the soul, argued that emotions are responses to events we consider important to our well-being. This idea helps us see hatred not as something irrational, but as a reaction to something that, somehow, deeply affects us. By identifying the causes of hatred, we can begin to work with it more consciously. An effective method for dealing with hatred is practicing self-reflection. When we feel hatred, we can ask ourselves, what is this emotion trying to tell me? This question can lead us to valuable insights about our needs, values, and fears. For example, if we hate a person who seems to always get what they want, we might be projecting our own frustration at not achieving our goals. By recognizing this, we can begin to work towards greater assertiveness and self-confidence. Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his work Nicomachean Ethics, suggested that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. This idea reminds us that self-reflection is essential to transform our negative emotions into opportunities for growth. Another important strategy is cultivating empathy. Although it may seem contradictory, trying to understand the perspective of those we hate can help us see beyond our projections and recognize the shared humanity that connects us. Roman philosopher Seneca, in his writings on anger, suggested that understanding is the first step towards healing. By trying to understand the motivations and circumstances of those we hate, we can begin to dissolve hatred and transform it into compassion. For example, if we hate someone who has hurt us, we can try to imagine the difficulties and challenges that person faces. This doesn't mean justifying their actions, but rather recognizing that we are all human and therefore fallible. Additionally, hatred can lead us to question our values and beliefs. Often we hate what challenges our deepest convictions. For example, a person who values honesty may hate those they perceive as liars. However, by exploring this hatred, they may discover that their own relationship with truth is not as simple as they imagined. Perhaps they themselves have lied in difficult situations or have trouble facing painful truths. This process of questioning can lead to greater authenticity and integrity. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." This idea suggests that by reflecting on our emotions and actions, we can create a future more aligned with our deepest values. Another important aspect is practicing forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or justifying what hurt us, but rather releasing the resentment and hatred we carry. German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that forgiveness is a virtue that frees us from the chains of hatred. By forgiving, we are not saying that what happened is right, but rather that we choose not to let hatred control our lives. Forgiveness can be a long and difficult process, but it is essential for emotional healing and personal growth. Finally, hatred can lead us to greater self-acceptance. When we recognize that the hatred we feel is, in part, a reflection of our own shadows, we can begin to accept those parts of ourselves that we previously rejected. Carl Jung wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This idea suggests that by confronting our darkest emotions, like hatred, we can achieve a state of greater balance and integrity. We've reached the end of this journey of reflection on hatred and its multiple layers. Throughout this video, we explored how hatred is not just a destructive emotion, but also a powerful tool for self-knowledge. We saw that behind hatred, there are often hidden fears, insecurities, and aspects of our shadow that need to be integrated. We learned that instead of repressing or denying hatred, we can use it as a mirror to better understand who we are and what really matters to us. We recalled the words of great thinkers like Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, and Seneca, who showed us that hatred is a deeply human emotion rooted in our instincts and internal conflicts. But more than that, they taught us that hatred can be transformed. When we look at it with courage and curiosity, it becomes an opportunity for growth, a chance to become more conscious, more empathetic, and more whole. If this video made you reflect on your own emotions and how they can be a path to self-knowledge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive more content like this. Share this study with your friends, as reflections like these can help many people better understand themselves and transform their lives. And of course, if you liked the video, leave your like. It really helps to bring this content to more people. Remember, hatred doesn't have to be a prison. It can be the beginning of a journey of self-knowledge and transformation. As Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." May we together bring more awareness to our emotions and thus write our own destiny. Thank you for watching this video all the way through. Until the next reflection.